my only credentials, if you like, to give this presentation are I'm just a citizen who's taken a strong interest in electric vehicles. Unfortunately, not yet an owner of one, but something I hope to rectify very soon. I haven't been involved in Citizens Climate Lobby before either, but my involvement in the climate movement has been through 350 and also a group called Sea Change in Canberra. So I suppose the background to this is that I believe quite strongly that from next year onwards, Australia would have the capability of making a serious start on emissions reduction in the transport sector, as for the first time we're getting multiple models of affordable quality EVs actually available for purchase. And also we're starting to see some public policy actions from governments, including that here in the ACT. So with that background, I think I'll just launch in, share my screen, and I just hope this works. So this should be it here. Hopefully everyone can see this, and I will just I'll just move on to. I'm not sure if I should go to slideshow on my PowerPoint. Possibly I should.
Yes, I think that would be better.
Okay, so look, I'm just going to talk about what we're up against in terms of the fact that there's actually going to be quite a political fight here. A quick look at what other countries are doing, and then in terms of the submission to the Senate inquiry, quickly skim through some points on the benefits of EVs, a bit of a detour onto the fuel excise issue, some of the recommendations that we made in relation to accelerating the uptake of EVs, industry opportunities, and then if there's time, a couple of words about autonomous vehicles and my own personal journey towards owning an EV. That should take 20 minutes, and then there will be time available to develop some of these points a bit more in questions. So this is just what we're up against. I mean, this is just to indicate there's going to be a political fight about any kind of policy issue to decarbonise in the transport sector. This is an article by Andrew Boldt last year titled "Hands Off Our Cars, Warmists." And you can just read the first paragraph there and you can see what Andrew Boldt thinks about any efforts to seriously reduce emissions, whether it's in electricity or in transport. And nextly, there's an article, fairly typical article by Ben Packham, a reporter for The Australian, earlier this year in May, who is taking the view that any attempts to introduce fuel efficiency standards in Australia is going to be terrible. It's going to eliminate a whole lot of models that people love. It's going to make cars more costly. And he quotes Senator Barry Sullivan, Queensland National Party senator, saying that he would die in a ditch to stop the introduction of any fuel efficiency standards in Australia. So that's just a context that there's going to be a battle, political battle here. In terms of the Senate inquiry, it was only initiated early last month, chaired by Senator Tim Storer, independent from South Australia, looking at the benefits of EVs, opportunities for EV manufacture or related industries in Australia, and measures to increase the uptake of EVs. When I looked yesterday, there'd been 92 submissions to this inquiry. And I've only read a dozen or so of them, but I was also privileged to edit the submissions from Canberra EV and also a briefer submission from 350 Canberra. So in other countries, things are happening, many other countries. Some countries have targets for the take-up of EVs, New Zealand being a good example. They're aiming to have 64,000 EVs in New Zealand by 2020. Many countries are implementing and strengthening fuel efficiency standards, which I will talk more about in a second. Countries are offering incentives, financial incentives for the purchase of EVs. Some jurisdictions are setting targets for including EVs in government car fleets, and the ACT government has just come on board with that strategy. Funding the rollout of charging infrastructure, perhaps filling gaps that are not already, that are left after organisations like Tesla and the NRMA have rolled out infrastructure for charging EVs. And in some countries, quite radical steps of announcing sunset dates for petrol and diesel vehicles. Again, I'll get onto that point a little later. So there's quite a lot happening in many countries. So just to start with the issue of fuel efficiency standards, because there is actually supposed to be some action happening in Australia in this area. We have standards in Australia for emissions from vehicles, but only for emissions such as nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, and so on, particulates. But there is now the MFVE, which is the Ministerial Forum on Vehicle Emissions, which consists actually of 3 federal ministers. They issued a discussion paper on the implementation of such standards in Australia, with the options that you can see there on the slide, and asked for comments. Meanwhile, in the European Union, they've actually got a target which they have approved of getting down to a lower amount of emissions. So these are expressed in terms of grams of CO2 emitted for every kilometre you drive. So the lowest Australian option proposed was 105 grams. The EU target for 2021 is 95 grams. And these numbers can also be converted to a fuel efficiency in terms of litres per 100 kilometres, or in America, miles per gallon. In America, there is now an effort by the Trump administration to roll back the Obama administration's efforts to get the fuel or the carbon emissions down to close to 100 grams per kilometre. The Trump administration is now proposing to freeze that from 2020 at a significantly higher level. And this next slide from the International Group on Transport Efficiency is just showing, it's a complicated slide, but the takeaway from this is to say that back in the year 2000, in many countries, the average emissions from vehicles, from light passenger vehicles, was around 180 to 200 grams per kilometre driven. We currently have moved that down in many countries to about 150, and the efforts now are to try to get that number down to around 100 grams. So that's, and in the US, the attempt is there now to try and stall that that reduction, those efficiency improvements, at around 150. Now, just turning back to the Senate inquiry, we were asked to comment on the benefits of electric vehicles, and we commented on it for both the motorist and for the community at large. For the motorist, there are reductions in running costs, so in terms of fuel and maintenance, significantly lower costs, improved and more enjoyable driving experience, the ability to fuel or charge the car at home or anywhere with a power point. On the other hand, to counteract those benefits, we've got a significant purchase price premium for an electric vehicle. I would estimate between $10,000 and $15,000 more expensive than a comparable petrol car. And if you're touring, there's the issue of the time needed to recharge compared to refilling a petrol car's tank. That's for the motorist. For the community at large, we talked about, first of all, the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions, which from my perspective is the most important benefit. And I think we're going to see transport being a key sector for driving down carbon emissions during the next 2 decades. There are, however, significant health benefits as well. Even though petrol cars often have catalytic converters, electric vehicles don't emit any nitrous oxides, sulfur oxides, carbon monoxides, particulates, and other substances that can damage health. And the other area of benefit is national fuel security, because currently Australia spends more than $40 billion per annum on importing petrol and oil, and also only has a relatively small number of days of available supply in Australia. So there is actually a national economic benefit as well if there was a move to EVs, reduce the dependence on imported petrol. So in our recommendation, we actually thought it would be nice if the Australian government publicly acknowledged the benefits, didn't merely say that electric cars are coming, get used to the idea, but actually say this is a good thing, that because of the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions, because of public health benefits, and because of national fuel security, to go on the front foot and advocate for them as they are doing in New Zealand. Now, this is a little sidebar on the fuel excise issue, because currently, of course, the price of petrol includes an excise, and that raises something like $10 billion a year, but it is now declining, and it will decline further as EVs are taken up by Australian motorists. From my membership of Canberra EV, it's clear that EV drivers accept that they should contribute to road costs and that they're willing to pay something like a per kilometre levy to replace or partly replace the fuel excise. And so that was the recommendation that we made at the bottom of this slide, and it was based on the recommendation made by AEVA nationally, that is the Australian Electric Vehicle Association. And in a sense, their recommendation suggests that there should be some level of fuel excise remaining in order to recover the social cost of carbon, but that all of the road development and road maintenance costs should be met from a per kilometre levy that should be applied to all vehicles. So here's a quick skim over some of the recommendations that the Canberra EV group made. We wanted to see a roadmap, a plan, a strategy for rollout of electric vehicles like they have in New Zealand. We suggested the federal government actually get on with fuel efficiency standards, because nothing has happened for 2 years since the federal government released its discussion paper with those options in it. Absolutely nothing's happened, and I suspect that's partly due to the pushback from some Conservative members of Parliament and commentators. We also suggested that now that the ACT government has announced some targets for EVs in its government car fleet, that other state and territory governments and the federal government could do likewise and start to look at the targets for EVs in government fleets. So in terms of the financial incentives, it's quite complicated because there are a number of taxes that apply to vehicles. And the way we framed financial incentives, taking our lead from the National Electric Vehicle Group, was to recommend there be a limited time waiver of GST, something like 3 years, so not an indefinite waiver. Exempt EVs from stamp duty, which is currently is what happens in the ACT. Restructure the luxury car tax. I can go into more detail there if you like, because it's a fairly complicated issue, but either abolish or restructure the luxury car tax to give more favoritism to lower emission vehicles. Reduce annual registration fees. That's also a policy in the ACT at the moment, have a discount on registration fees. And we basically suggested that it's time for the relevant part of COAG to actually have a discussion about how to encourage electric vehicles through financial incentives in some nationally consistent way. So some other recommendations that we made to accelerate the uptake of EVs were to ask state and territory governments to develop plans to fill any gaps in charging infrastructure. So yes, infrastructure is being rolled out by Tesla, by the NRMA, and by some others, but we suggested that state governments could identify any gaps in terms of major highways feeding regional towns and cities, and to try to fill those gaps. We thought that there's a special challenge for people living in apartments to charge up their electric vehicle, and we wanted the state and territory governments to work with relevant stakeholders to try and come up with some solutions to those barriers. And we also thought that even though we didn't really expect any Australian government to announce sunset dates for petrol and diesel vehicles, it could be a step too far at the moment, we thought that the relevant federal body or the ministers should actually talk about the implications for Australia of the sunset dates that are being announced by other countries, like France, the UK, the Netherlands and China, and what the implications are for Australia, given that we're such a vehicle importing country. Now, Rod, you might want to tell me if I've got 5 minutes or less left, and I will cut some of this rest of this short. But
you're on track. You're going fine.
Okay, so one of the other terms of reference for the inquiry was, what are the opportunities for making EVs or for manufacturing parts of the EV supply chain in Australia? We noted that Australia has rich resources of lithium, particularly in the Pilbara area of Western Australia. There hasn't been much emphasis from government on the value of exploiting those resources. We noted that we've got some companies like C Electric who are actually in the process of making commercial electric vehicles, vans and utes and so on, and companies like Tritium that are developing high capacity charging infrastructure, and they should be encouraged. And in this context, we noted that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation exists and that it should be encouraged to maintain and strengthen its investment in such companies. And in fact, that the CEFC does already invest in the company called C Electric. So we just thought that that should continue and strengthen. We also thought that there could be an issue in the next decade in starting to train auto mechanics to work with EVs and to be able to maintain them, give advice on battery conditions and battery replacement and so on. I read some other submissions. I've still got lots more to read, but there was a few other ideas, and I've just put them on this slide. I might talk about the passenger vehicle tariff because I wasn't aware of this. This is yet another tax that currently applies to vehicles. It applies to vehicles that come from countries with whom Australia does not have a free trade agreement. And it's another 5% added to the cost of the vehicle. Now, that actually affects a couple of electric vehicles. It affects the Renault Zoe and it affects the BMW i3, whose prices are increased by that passenger vehicle tariff. And I became aware of it when I read the submission from the Motor Dealers Association. One other suggestion was to scrap the luxury car tax and actually have a high emissions tax instead. If there is in fact a public policy to drive down emissions in transport, or there ought to be such a policy, then replacing the luxury car tax with a high emissions tax could be a sensible thing to do. I'll just leave those points on the screen and continue because I wanted to say just a few things about autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, if you like. I've worked with a colleague and friend of mine, Kent Fitch, on this topic, and Kent has done a lot of work in this area. We both think that ride-sharing models coupled with self-driving cars could revolutionise transport in the 2030s. Kent would actually suggest that could happen earlier than the 2030s. And this is the idea of transport as a service, where people no longer, or some people, no longer want to own a car, but they're happy to simply travel in a driverless taxi, an Uber vehicle with no driver. It takes them where they want to go. And if that's associated with ride-sharing models, this kind of scenario actually can support a significant reduction in the number of cars on the road. And my colleague Kent Fitch has actually done a simulation of what this could mean for Canberra in terms of number of vehicles required in the fleets, daily trips, costs, and so on. And 350 Canberra, which I belong to, in its submission to the ACT government's climate strategy, actually asked the ACT government to study and plan for this scenario and perhaps rework the simulation that Kent did, which is on this next slide. That's an interesting website, which I commend anyone who's interested in the use of autonomous vehicles in a ride-sharing mode to have a look at that website. Just to say, this is my final, almost my final point, is that I don't yet own an electric vehicle. I missed an opportunity between 2013 and 2016 to buy a first-generation Nissan Leaf. I consider the only other cars I can buy in the last couple of years, a Tesla Model S or X and a BMW i3, are just too expensive. I've joined the queue for a Tesla Model 3. There were 450,000 people in the queue when I joined. The queue's now down to about 395,000. So I'm moving up in the queue, but I don't expect the Model 3 to be in Australia before about the middle of 2020. If you live in Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide or Perth, you can now buy a Renault Zoe from a local dealer. It's just become available from local dealers in those 4 cities, not yet in Canberra. And this next generation Nissan Leaf will not be in Australia till next March. And what I'm actually hoping to do is to buy a Hyundai Ioniq as soon as it becomes available. And there'll be an announcement about that next month. And I've actually bugged the Hyundai dealers several times this year about when this is going to happen. So that's my aspiration. That's the end of a fairly quick talk from me on the EV inquiry, except just to say that 350 Canberra, which I belong to, has written a number of submissions on climate matters, and they're on this 350 Canberra website. And there are 2 in particular that we put our heart and soul into. One was the Josh Frydenberg review of federal government's climate policies, which was May last year. And the other was the submission we made to the ACT government on their climate strategy earlier this year. So if you're interested in reading more about our thoughts in climate, those are freely available from our website. So I'm going to finish there, and perhaps we can open up some of the things I mentioned more in questions.